Hey guys, this is Echo Soundworks with ADSR. You're checking out a mixing and production tip and trick tutorial video. So I'm going to demystify all things sidechain compression and sidechain related in this video. So if you're a beginner or an intermediate producer, engineer, or maybe you're just getting involved in electronic music, this is going to help you out regardless of what genre you produce. So we're going to start at the basics, start to talk about the core concepts of what is sidechaining, what's sidechain compression, why you do it. And from there, we're going to move into more advanced techniques. Not necessarily advanced so much as they'll be more creative. So there are a lot of creative things you can do with your sidechaining and with your sidechain compression. So we're gonna just dive right into a DAW and get started. So first things first, why do you want to sidechain compress? Well, there's two reasons. One is a mix perspective, and one's more of a creative perspective. The mix perspective is it makes getting things to gel together easier, right? In electronic music, your kick is very important. So if you want to get things out of the way of the kick, you can sidechain compress. Take this example. Right, the volume of my bass is ducking as my kick hits. And that makes it easier to mix. It makes it easier to kind of set volumes. I don't have to have my kick super loud to get the kick to stand out over the bass, because basses and kicks share frequencies. That's why it's so common to use sidechain compression on a kick and a bass combo. So, and the second reason, again, is creative. So there's a lot of elements being sidechain compressed in this track. Some are different settings. Some I'm using actual external plugins like the LFO tool to mimic sidechain compression. We'll talk all about that more later in the video, but I like how it sounds. It sounds cool. It accentuates the vibe of the track. It gives it this stop and go feeling. So if you are a beginner, you still might be asking, well, why compression? Why not sidechain limiting, sidechain multiband EQ, right? It's simple. It's because compression and compressors lend themselves to gain reduction. That's one of the main purposes of a compressor in a mix, is gain reduction. So we're trying to reduce the gain of our bass every time the kick hits. Now you could, if you didn't want to use a sidechain compressor, you could open up your automation in your DAW and you could automate down the volume every time a kick hits. That can be a pain in the butt when you have a kick pattern that has a lot of kicks per bar. That's just not easy. That's why it's just simpler, more effective to use sidechain compression. So let's look at some real-world examples of setting up sidechain compression in some third-party compressors, because I've touched on every DAW has its own little way of handling sidechain input, right? In Logic, it's up here. Ableton, you go to your expanded view and you can choose it. Pro Tools, FL Studio, same thing, right? They all have their own way of setting up the sidechain input. But each third-party plugin might have a slightly different way of actually turning the sidechain on in the plugin itself. So here are two of my favorite compressors. The one on the left, the VC160, is actually one of my favorite compressors for sidechain compression. We'll look at that in a second. So I've already sidechained in the Ghost Kick. But as we can see and hear, the sidechain compression isn't active. Well, if this was the stock Logic compressor, it would be working. What's going on? Well, this specific plugin has a sidechain input that you must turn on down here, and it even has a sidechain gain that's independent from the threshold, and that's why it is, in my opinion, one of the best compressors out there for sidechain compression. So the next one I've pulled up is Cytomic, the glue. This is the same compressor that is in Ableton, the glue compressor. So same thing. I've selected my Ghost Kick, I hit play. I'm just getting general compression. The thing I have to look for is either some type of control, right? In this one, it's called EXT in for external. It does say sidechain. So just look for sidechain, SC, EXT, external in, and you should find the section of the compressor where you might have to turn on an extra button or flip an extra switch. All right, so let's look at the two different types of tracks you can use to trigger your sidechain. There are ghost tracks, and then there are just the normal audible tracks within your mix. So I've been using a ghost track this entire video. A ghost track is simply a track that can't be heard. It's not audible, but the DAW can hear it and see it, if that makes sense. So if I solo this, you'll see that my volume meters are moving around, but we can't hear anything. All I did was take the output off. You don't have to mute it, you don't have to turn things down, you just take the output off. So that's a ghost track. Now, an audible track would be like compressing with the actual kick in your mix, right? You can do that. You can do both. I wouldn't say there's a clear-cut winner. I personally prefer using a ghost kick more often than not, and we're going to look at those reasons why. So let's look at two reasons why you would use a ghost track or ghost kick to trigger your sidechain versus the actual track in your mix. So the first reason, and this one is kind of a no-brainer, I think, is you're working with a loop. So before this video, I bounced my drums to a loop in this verse section, the first half of it, so you can see how this works. This loop has everything in it: kick, snare, hi-hat, right? So it's not like I could use this track to trigger my sidechain, because it would happen on the snare, the kick, and the hats. So what I did was I found a kick sample, and I made it kind of mimic and mirror every time my kick hit. I did add a couple extra hits, and we'll touch on that in a second, but that's really all you have to do. And then that gives you the ability to sidechain compress with your instruments, your bass, your vocals, your lead, whatever you need to do while you're working with a drum loop. Now, the second reason you would use a ghost kick or a ghost track is it gives you more control. So there's kind of like bullet points with this idea, but you have so much more control over when your instruments or when your other sources in your mix are going to actually duck. So let's look at this. This kick is actually a different sample than this kick. This kick that I found has more body. It has a longer tail. That's going to mean that the sidechain compressor is going to be triggered for longer. Now, you could do the opposite. You could use a really short kick to trigger your sidechain, right? I liked how this sounded with the bass and the instruments for this demo. So that's kind of the first element of having more control. You don't have to use the same sample. You can use any sample you want as long as it fits what you're going for. Now, the second bit of having more control is you can have the sidechain compression active when there are no kicks in your actual mix. And that's what's happening here. So let me undo that move that I just did. All right, so if we look at bar 10, there's no kick, right? And that's a downbeat. So after this hit right here, there's no kick until here. That's almost an entire bar. So that means my bass doesn't duck almost an entire bar. Well, what I did was I put an extra kick in my ghost track at bar 10, so it does duck there, and that's what we just heard. So if I mute this, right, and that's actually the start of a new note. So it's kind of, that's where a new note on my progression hits. So it just sounded weird not ducking, so I stuck a ghost kick there. So the third bullet point of having more control with a ghost track when you're sidechain compressing versus your actual audible track in your mix is you can change the volume of different parts within your ghost track and it won't affect actually your whole mix, right? Let's say this kick was audible. It's not like I could go in and be like, oh, I really want more sidechain compression at bar 10. So what I can do is really turn up that kick. You couldn't do that because it would just ruin your mix. Your kick would be all of a sudden louder, right? Or even quieter if you wanted less sidechain compression. So what you can do is you can actually turn up the clip gain of the source material that you're using for your ghost track. For instance, if we look at our compressor here, and I turn down the volume on my ghost track, it doesn't matter. It's still going to sidechain compress the exact same amount. We can see and hear that. Now, you can change it with clip gain. Clip gain will actually change the appearance of your audio in most DAWs. So let me zoom in here. So if I go in Logic, it's under region, it'll say clip gain. If I turn this down, you can see that my audio for my ghost kick sample is actually getting quieter. So if I crank this way down on these first two hits, we're gonna have any sidechain compression, and then we ramp it back up, right? So you have control over every individual hit in this manner. So let's say at bar 10, going back to bar 10, because there's no kick in my actual mix at bar 10, let's say I didn't want this to be as sidechain compressed. Well, all I'd have to do is turn down the clip gain of that sample, and let's listen to it. So just a little bit of sidechain compression, a little bit of ducking. Let's look at our VU meter. Right, so let's turn it down even a little bit more to accentuate this. So with the first two hits, we have it's in between -10 and -5. And then that one's under -5, right? So really cool technique to give you more control over when and how things are sidechain compressing in your mixes. Now that we've covered the basics of sidechain and sidechain compression, let's look at some more advanced and creative techniques to up your game. So first tip and trick or technique that you can do to get a better, more interesting, unique sound is to sidechain compress in stages. right? So these chord sounds, these blue tracks here, they're being sidechain compressed in stages. And by that, I simply just mean instead of having one compressor that's really sidechaining and pumping really hard, you do it with a couple tracks, a couple stacks of compressors, and you lightly sidechain compress on each one. And so it adds up to a more kind of complete sound, and it's a little bit more dynamic. So let's check this out really quick. This first track here, I have a compressor that is sidechained to the main kick. The second track here is not using a sidechain compressor, but it's using the LFO tool, which is a pumping effect. It creates pseudo sidechain compression, and I'm using that with the other track that has normal sidechain compression on it. Right? And on the actual group, I group those two tracks together. I have the VC160 that's actually linked, and the sidechain input is set to a second ghost kick. So these yellow tracks up here are the ghost tracks. We have ghost kick 1 right here and ghost kick 2 right there. So there's two different compressors, different settings, and the LFO tool, sidechain compressing in stages. So the second tip and trick that we're going to look at is applying swing to your ghost tracks or anything that's triggering your sidechain compression. So in Logic, I can go to my region, which is a drop-down menu over on your left, and I can select a swing value. And if I have things set up properly with, how I have my kick set up or my ghost track, it'll apply a little bit of swing. Now, with a open-ended groove like this one, this isn't going to be super noticeable, but with 4 on the floor type tracks, it actually is really noticeable. Now, let's say you're not using a ghost kick and actual sidechain compression. Let's say that you opted to use something like the LFO tool. Well, the LFO tool and a couple other of these types of plugins actually have a swing function, so I can add swing to this. Now, let's play this track with a little bit of swing. Right? Really high values, you can add like a little bit of jitteriness to this track. So our third advanced sidechain compression technique is using sidechain compression on an aux or a bus send that has effects like reverb, delay, things that are wet and that can eat up a lot of space in your mix. So I've pulled in some new tracks here in this demo. Let's listen real quick. Now, on these lead tracks, I have a bus set up on a couple of them that have the Sound Toys effect rack, which has some delay, some saturation going on. And then we have the Seventh Heaven reverb as well, with a pretty good, pretty long reverb at 1.95 seconds. Now, I also have 2 compressors. So if we solo this, right, we can't really hear it when I'm listening to the track in its entirety, but let's solo these, and I'm going to solo our ghost kick and our ghost snare, and I'm also going to just solo the reverb send. All right, so you can hear that. So when the reverb starts to get really long, there's that ducking, that kind of sidechain compression that's occurring, and it breaks it up. So these spots in my mix where the vocal isn't occurring actually has room to breathe, but there's still a little bit. Now, it's important when you're doing this to think about the context of your mix. That's why I have 2 compressors on my bus. One is being triggered by our ghost kick. The other is being triggered by the snare, because as we can see with this melody here, the vocal chop does occur on the actual snare hits, so it made sense to put it on both the snare and the kick. All right, so the final kind of advanced tip and trick we're going to look at with sidechain compression in this video is sidechaining things that aren't typical, right? It might seem like that's not that big of an idea, but you would be surprised. So for instance, leads, basses, chords, those things always get sidechained. What about the hi-hats? What about your top loop? What about something that you wouldn't expect, right? Maybe try flipping the script. Maybe have more of the rhythmic pulsating bounce sound with things like your top loops, your hi-hats, and then maybe that will require you not to have to sidechain compress as heavily with the more kind of typical sidechain compressed elements like your basses, your leads, and your chords. So that sums up this video on all things sidechain compression, guys. If you have any questions or comments, let me know below, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can. Like I said at the beginning of the video, I'm Echo Soundworks. Thank you so much for watching, guys. I'll see you next time.